So good morning again, and welcome to Crumbs under the table, out in an environment where there are of course no tables, but you understand, it's all about the dogs really. So what are we thinking about today? Well, I thought I'd kind of give myself an easy morning, go back to a subject that I've taught about and written about quite a few times. But I just thought, I think I've ever done it as we're walking with the dogs. It's just there's a tension, there's a kind of a lovely sort of mystery in a verse that we read so quickly and we kind of skim over it that we kind of actually miss its impact. I'm just going to turn this around. It's actually at the end of Luke 2, which of course has been covering, first of all Luke covers the childhood of John the Baptist, and then he covers the childhood of Jesus, and at the end of it just says, Jesus continued to grow in wisdom, in stature, and in favour with God and with men. Now you've got to remember that at this stage, there's some nice little obvious bits. At this stage, Jesus is still a young adult. He's not stepped into his kind of main ministry, and it's really important, as we notice there. Therefore, God's favour on him, and so on. This is all being worked out in very normal life. It's not about him at this stage doing the great public miracles. It's about him being a private individual with a regular kind of calling, i.e. and so on. But actually, if you just stop and unpack it, there's some bits, because we often just kind of read that as a kind of throwaway to grow up, but it's quite layered, it's quite specific. Wisdom, let's think about that for a second. Stature, which I'm going to argue in a minute, is really character. It's used in the same way that we use stature when we talk about someone's stature. And favour, which it really gets kind of confusing, because it's actually the word charis, which just means grace. In other words, so the question is, so in what way does Jesus have more grace as he gets older that he didn't have when he was younger? So there's some things to kind of just tease out. And I always predicate it in the kind of the concept of actually understanding the full humanity of Jesus. So in obviously, there's that point later in Jesus' ministry where he says, "No one knows except the Father." We think, well, once Jesus has ascended, he probably knows at that point. So it is a kind of a temporary not knowing, which is somehow limited by his perspective as a human. In his humanity, and Jesus experiences the limits that we all have, and he lives within that context with some level of perfection. When I say some level of perfection, that can seem terrible. How could something's either perfect or it's not? But actually, a perfect screw is not as inspiring as a kind of a perfect engine, or if you want to think of it like that, that actually there's limits on this kind of little component, the nuts and the bolts and the screws, compared with actually to understand the perfection of an engine, which has to have loads more levels and so on of perfection in it. So something about Jesus' humanity grows with it. So things that we can assign to kind of his kind of godlike nature, his God nature, not godlike, his God nature, we have to then bring into this kind of perspective in his humanity. But in that sense, it then becomes a model for us. So once we really kind of get the truth, and that's perhaps what I'm driving at with this verse, is this verse speaks to Jesus' full humanity, and as such, it means the life of Jesus becomes a template to understand our own lives against. Because sometimes it's easy to kind of drop into a sort of an excuse, which is, well, Jesus could do that because he was God after all. But actually that doesn't sit easily with trying to interpret what does it mean for him to grow in these things. So let's just think about that for a minute. So we start with wisdom, which is a nice easy one. Well, wisdom's not just knowledge. Wisdom is kind of the appropriate application, but there is something of knowledge. But actually at a very simple basic level, that's important. In other religious systems, avatars of deities are often born with kind of complete knowledge of the universe. You imagine Jesus lying in the straw in the manger, looking up at the stars, calculating how many millions of light years they are away, and kind of smiling to himself that, a couple of thousand years' time, a bloke called Einstein's going to come up with a reasonable approximation to the truth. It's going to be tested, but of course he knows better, because the child in the straw has all of God's knowledge kind of squeezed into him. So we understand, no, he doesn't have that. He doesn't even have basic words as he's born. He just has the instincts of humanity to look for love in the eyes of the parents looking down towards it, and to feel something into his own body, and to start to create within himself the model of the world that will make most sense of the life he's going to live. And so there is a need for Jesus to grow in knowledge, but that's not necessarily the same as wisdom. So there is something about the way he grows in knowledge that then has to produce in him the correct strategies to apply what he knows. So we can sort of live with that, but even in its own way, it has a sort of radical challenge to kind of simplistic understandings of the mission of Jesus. And then we kind of move on to that issue of stature and character, and it's easy to say, well, it just means, as Jesus grew, he got bigger, which doesn't say very much if you take stature in a kind of that sort of literal sense, meaning to get bigger. But similarly, we look at Jesus, who's presented. This is the gospel according to the prophet Isaiah, beginning of Mark's gospel. And Isaiah just says he has no features that we should look at him. He has no kind of discerning things. So it can't mean that Jesus was 6 foot tall and really impressive. Stature doesn't mean that, because it can mean. It means, as it does in English very often, stature is really kind of a different way of saying character. He grows in character. He has maturity in his character. And that's again stretch. Well, it's not necessarily more character. And we don't think a year and a half, because actually there's something sad about the orderness or the order of the world around him that's somehow been disturbed, and actually in a strange sort of way that speaks to the bigger issues. And it's not wrong to feel some sort of pain in that context when we recognise disorder. So maybe it's not appropriate as a 1-year-old for Jesus to cry over spilt milk, but both break your knee, and again at the age of 4. But if when you're 20 you burst into tears, because the tears for a scraped knee is not normally to do with physical pain, it's emotional embarrassment and all of those sorts of things. So there's something where we understand that character is appropriate to your understanding and comprehension, and he can talk about loving and forgiving your enemies as he becomes a young adult, because actually as he's encountered more of the world, as he sees how injustice is no longer just spilt milk, I can put it that way, but actually he's always grown and he's always had an appropriate response, and somehow in his character he's managed to sift out from every experience what it is he needs to learn, and to reject the invitation to things that would make him less, just like we all do. Obviously our belief is he does it more perfectly than we do, but they're both things that need to be grown in. So he needs to grow in knowledge. It's not all supernatural. He has to sit in the synagogue and learn the knowledge, and then he has to apply the knowledge well. And so he reads about things in the Old Testament, in Old Testament periods, and where the punishments were more severe than they were in the current day. And he has to work out that just because they were good people doing bad things, that actually today is a different season. And God has moved our understanding and our agenda on. And so he's able to say, the ancients said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But what I'm saying to you now is turn the other cheek. I'm not contradicting them. They were inspired in their moment, because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was better than what Jacob's sons did when their sister was raped and they killed a whole community as punishment. An eye for an eye puts a limit on our revenge. So that was a good thing in its day, but now I'm taking it further. And I'm saying you have a choice. You can demand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's not a bad foundation. But I'm going to say, why don't you turn the other cheek, you see? So he's able to kind of assimilate those things and apply them with wisdom into the current context, be led by the Spirit to kind of stretch the boundaries of where that older revelation finished, if you like, and take it into where he needs to stretch it. So that's wisdom. As he experiences the world, he learns to feel the pain appropriately without allowing himself to take on the negative aspects that would actually now want to exclude those who very often are acting out of their own pain and their own failure. So evil always starts with failure. at some level. And then we come to the interesting one, which is favour. As I said, the word favour actually is the word charis. It's the word grace. So what does it mean to say that Jesus grows in grace? Does it mean that when he was 20, the Father was kind of pouring more grace out on him than when he was 12, for instance? Is it just something that comes with age? And so there's a kind of a rather obvious thing in it. And yeah, one of the things is to recognise that actually our English Bibles, on the whole, use 3 words for the same Greek word, charis. So sometimes, and it's all to do with context. So we have to kind of put the word into context. So when grace is something I give, it's grace. So it's something almost metaphysical, or I don't know how, so I can give grace. So I can give charis, and when I give charis, it's grace. The thing that I give. So if I give grace, it might be that you owe me some money. So I go and pay the debt. So now the money that I used to pay the debt, well, that's a gift. So charis now has become a gift. So it was grace, and now it's a gift. And if me on the other end, as you say, look, I know you owe me, but I'm going to pay it. And here's the money that I'm going to pay it with, or however it goes. I've not come up with a very good example here, but maybe it's a shop debt or something, and they're paying to a third party. So I know that I know that you need it done. This is my grace. I'm going to cover it. Here's the money. That's the gift. And if I'm me on the other end, I now kind of say, okay, I receive that. And for me as the receiver, charis has now become favour. So I could reject it or I can receive it. And so the fact that our English translations use the word favour here for the word charis is an indication that there's something, if you like, about the life that Jesus is living as he gets older. And remember, at this stage, the verse, Jesus has never done a miracle. He's never preached a sermon that we know of, maybe had an experimental one as a teenager in his local synagogue or something. Stuff that we just don't know. But that we know of. There's nothing in that sense. It's not, oh, well, Jesus is praying for the sick, that's God's favour on him. It's just something more normal, if I can put it that way, more natural. But as he has grown in his wisdom, in his knowledge and understanding, and in that context, as that wisdom has shaped a character that has not allowed himself to become disturbed by, if you like, what is disturbed out there, but actually to grow with kind of that emotional maturity, his life becomes a bigger receptacle to capture the grace which God has always poured out, and he pours out on all humanity. He makes the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. He makes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. Both of those are quotes. Does both, because we all need different things in different seasons. But the point is, God pours out grace without measure on all of humanity. But not all of humanity exhibits God's favour. Because there is something about the way we grow in those other things that make us better receptacles and containers and channels of that grace. If we're a pipe full of leaks, by the time we're trying to deliver, if you like, God's favour to somebody else through our lives, we've lost most of it. And that seems to be part of the kind of the dynamic. So that's the kind of the way I put those 3 things together. And of course then the real challenge comes about in that context where you say, well, in that those verses are appropriate because Jesus is fully human. So Jesus came not so much to show us what God could do, because if he's going to show us what God could do, I just need to kind of come out here, look at the trees, come out to the night sky, look at the stars, go down to the coast, look at the sea. There's all sorts of testimonies for what God can do around me. But actually, it's more that when Jesus came, he came to show us what mankind can be. And as such, his life then becomes a challenge to me. Knowledge, how do I learn to process that into me in a way that becomes wisdom? And that's a genuine spiritual discipline. It's an exercise, it's something to ask ourselves. Jesus says of his disciples, he matches these things. He says, if you really are my disciples, so if you're really on the program, then you'll know truth and it will set you free. You'll know the truth and it will set you free. In other words, they are growing in understanding, but understanding is actually becoming wisdom that is, by application, is liberating. You see that you'll know truth, that's understanding, but it's setting you free. We know the relevance of that truth in a way that makes a difference to the process of life, and that's wisdom. So that's how you get on the program with Jesus. If you're really my disciples, you'll be like that. Then he goes on and says, and this is the way the world knows you're my disciples. It's because of the love you have for one another. Well, love is right at the heart of good character. Character is driven by an experience of either love or fear. And when we feel secure in the arms of love, our character is far better than when we feel nervous and attacked. And so actually this is a statement about that kind of growth of character, that wisdom is now, you're beginning to see how much God is for you, how pro you God's agenda really is, and that gives you a kind of a place of security, which is the foundation of an experience of love from God. Because love is not just a woolly concept, it's very practical, and it brings that to the human soul, and out of that we're able to love better. And so you really are on my program if you know truth, which is giving you wisdom, so you're free. and now, because you're on the program, one of the fruits of that people are seeing is that they can tell it because of the way you love each other. And then finally, in John's Gospel, he only makes these 3 statements. He says, and you'll prove to be my disciples in that you bear much fruit. In other words, just like Jesus, what we're now seeing is, and that's the context of that verse, is the things that you're praying for, you're seeing answers to. That there's something about God's favour and grace that's poured out freely and liberally on all mankind that somehow is channeling itself through our agendas. We are becoming a good channel to God's grace. We are exhibiting his favour. We are seeing answers to our prayers. And so you can see those things that Jesus grew in, he turns around and makes them a kind of the hallmarks of his own discipleship program. If you really are my followers, you'll be growing in that knowledge and it becomes wisdom. You'll have that character change which shows love, and you'll be having answers to prayer that people will call fruit. So we are supposed to model what Jesus has pioneered for us. And I always find it's a useful question just to apply to myself. Just kind of all those ways. Have I taken on, in a way, not something that binds me up? Part of the way I understand that is, does it actually enable me to feel security and love from God more in a way that actually then can allow me to be more generous and gracious with those around me? And then my trust, my faith, is actually, so the proof of the pudding kind of comes down to those things, now there are always prayers that we pray and they don't get answered. That's not the thing. It doesn't say every single prayer. It's just that they're fruitful in prayer, that something about our lives that is good at directing the grace of God. And there are all sorts of bits on that to kind of highlight about how we use prayer and so on, but you get the gist. I'm sure you get the gist. And the Holy Spirit, under his guidance, letting him arrange it in us. And then part of the way I understand that is actually somehow I can look at those who I find wind me up more, and who I find being sucked in and deceived by the very kind of things that I knew almost sucked me in and deceived me too. And that sounds very patronising, doesn't it, when I say it that way, but actually I can love them because I understand it better. And then actually my prayer and my hope is actually therefore we have some abilities to release the goodness of God through ourselves and through our lives better. So those are my thoughts for this morning. Just about kind of getting down to the far corner, and I'm going to start heading back with the dogs once we get down here. Some days I do a bit further. And just kind of flagging again, because I am working slowly on this new series. I wanted to get ahead of the game, get 4 or 5 videos done, something weekly, where I will look at every single little section of verses. Every single word from every gospel will be integrated into a single narrative, and we'll kind of analyse it from a textual point of view, from a theological point of view, from a sociological point of view, from a historical point of view, and start to get a kind of much more fully rounded picture of the whole of the ministry of Jesus. So I really want to encourage you, if you're not already signed up on the YouTube page, to do so, because those will be starting literally in a couple of weeks. I'm just working on some of the editing at the moment on the things I've been recording for that, so they will be starting soon. So please give me a bit of encouragement by signing up on the YouTube page. If you've made it this far in this morning's video, you must get something out of these. So anyway, quick prayer. Father, thank you for today. And Father, just as I come across new information, just keep that process moving right from the beginning. Help me to process it well into wisdom. In Jesus' name, amen.